All right. One of the challenges in trying to get this together is we're hoping for an interactive session. If you want to try, if you have your laptop, or I think you're going to need a laptop to get a chance to read it, you can go through TinyURL, IDM AI 23. It will be mildly, well, maybe not overwhelming, but there's a lot of information there. Let me just take my own advice. And you would end up at a GitHub repository that I put together with a README.
Can you go back to the slide when we can actually? Thank you.
Flip over here. You should end up at a repository that looks like this, and in the README are a few steps here about signing in with ChatGPT, if possible, using the GitHub account. And then you can work with the repository, create a code space where you could actually do editing and running code. I recognize that this is always a challenge when using coding. So what I would want to do then is get back to the presentation, try to go through the part where I talk, and then we get to the live demos quickly for those of you who aren't taking a stab at getting online through these instructions. All right. One more time. Probably. Maybe.
Jim, write this on the board.
Sure. Thank you. Should do it. All right, so my own experience with this, as also I've mentioned a couple times, has been just over the past few months since ChatGPT came on the scene in December, started looking at that and then realizing I should try out GitHub's Copilot that works in the editor. And I'm pretty impressed. I find it pretty magical what AI can do with, number one, starting with an English prompt, realizing that just communicating with our coworkers about what C code should do is hard, let alone talking to the machine and then figuring out that it really pretty much understood me. But as I mentioned at the start, you have to bring your own coding skills. So part of getting a good prompt to the system involves thinking about what's the machine going to do, what are the steps that I want it to do, and then trying to figure out if the answer is good also requires some of your own coding skills. So you need to bring some of those to the party here. Trying to give a little bit of background. So ChatGPT, the version that came out in December that made a lot of news was 3.5. They're up to version 4 now, mostly tuned for conversational applications. The context of those LLMs is from about 4,000 tokens, roughly words, up to there's a version of GPT-4 that has 32K buffer, which is sort of interesting when you think about how is this going to help me with my work. In the language presentation, there's the idea that with some systems you can take a corpus of papers that might be of interest to you, and that becomes part of the 32,000 words of context as that system gives you a synopsis. Think about the same thing that I haven't tried yet, which is, can I give it a whole bunch of my own code, or can I give it the code behind a library that I want to use and then have it help me use that in the correct manner because it's already read all of the source code of some part of NumPy or my AI package that I'm interested in. So Copilot comes through GitHub, built off of the OpenAI Codex, which was built off of GPT-3, and then trained on a lot of source material from GitHub itself. They mentioned that it was highly specific for Python, but we'll see that it is conversant in MATLAB, R, LOL code, and Python, as well as C++ and a number of others. And then I appreciate this quote from one of the pages I found about OpenAI's use it for transpilation, so translating code from one language to another, which we'll look at, explaining code, which we'll look at, and refactoring code, which all of were the activities I wanted to demo today. So as mentioned, we'll look shortly at an explanation of some existing code. We will look at optimizing through some refactoring. Then we'll look at translating from MATLAB to Python. We will then either work on writing some code from scratch, or we'll look at jumping all the way up to asking it to write us an SIR or a CIR model. So personally, I have asked it to write a script for me in the Julia programming language, which I've been trying to find time to learn, but have not learned yet. I was able to give it a good explanation of what I wanted it to do. I was able to run it in the Julia environment, and it was correct, which was a pleasant surprise. I have used it to work on loading JSON data and then getting out what I need from that and manipulating it in certain ways. A helpful thing is getting all the little squiggles from my editor that says you haven't put any doc strings in here for documentation. Well, Copilot is pretty good at looking at the function and giving a quick synopsis that's at least a start for documentation at just through tab completion. Start off with, if you're familiar with this, in Python, triple quotes starts a multi-line string. It indicates a doc string. You give it triple quotes, and Copilot will suggest a doc string for you, which is very helpful. I've used it to translate from some very specific Intel instructions over to ARM Neon for these new Apple Silicon machines, which was very helpful. We're going to see it work on some MATLAB code, and then there's an example in the repository of some R code as well. All right, so just for fun, I was curious, has anyone here heard of lol code? So you may remember this probably 15 years ago now. One of many varieties of cat jokes and things on the internet was a certain vocabulary for cats. And this is a programming language that works in that way. You notice that the beginning of the program over here starts with hi. Can you see my cursor? Yes. And ends with K, thanks, bye. There is a loop in the top of the middle one. I'm in the loop, incrementing your count until count and answer are the same. In any case, you might entertain yourself at some other point looking up lol code. It is kind of fun, but I was impressed that ChatGPT was perfectly happy to write me the FizzBuzz program in lol code. All right, so let's get into something a little bit more real. This is some MATLAB code that we came across with at IDM, and we wanted to move it over to Python. So as part of that, I wanted to see if I could get an explanation from ChatGPT about what was in here. And ChatGPT was happy to oblige with a lot of information. I would claim, I'm stealing my own thunder here. I would claim that this is probably only about 20% useful with some of the comments. I know it's hard to read around line 6, display message. This command displays the message. Okay, thank you. Even without knowing a whole lot of MATLAB, I probably could have figured that part out. But I think there are a few nuggets in here that are useful. So pull these out. This comparison about tote read less than 5. Well, one of the things that it's picked out is that we're processing samples. There's a mention of genes. There's a mention of gene index. So ChatGPT has already assumed that this is about dealing with genetic samples and and sequencing. So it's assuming that there's a read count from the sequencing. Okay. I stole some of the code. Sorry, I didn't steal. I've covered up some of the code down here at the bottom. XNREF divided by tote read, which is kind of interesting because the other lines of code just stick some unknown magic numbers into the outputs, but there's a ratio. So highlighting that this might be interesting for us to go figure out or ask the original person what that ratio means or note that it's different from the other code. And then the summary at the bottom is pretty good. Is it better than what we would get from ourselves? Not necessarily, but does point out that it's doing cleaning, normalization, and returns the information in X and XA. Of course, what it can't do is what we also can't do. As I mentioned, there are a number of magic numbers. Y is 5, the limit for the read. What do 4, 0, 1, and 2 mean in the X array? Who knows? And ChatGPT can't figure out that information any better than we can. Still, it's kind of an interesting exercise. So, as I mentioned, we wanted to move this over to Python. So one of the first things I wanted was to pull this code out in order to be able to run it independently, look at what the inputs were, look at what the outputs were so I could compare it to the other code. So I asked it to pull this out of the script into its own function. And it's done a very nice job. It has captured for us the 2 variables that are returned. It suggested this name, clean and normalize. And that was very quick. Then I realized, well, again, as I mentioned, I am bringing a little bit of my coding knowledge to this story. And I know that MATLAB is more performant if you ask it to do vector operations over matrices rather than doing explicit for loops. So I asked it if it would do the optimization for me, and it did. However, if we compare to the original code, we'll find that there are a few problems. Actually, there's on a good note. I'll give it credit here. It took what was basically the default code or the default case and initialized its outputs with those values, which works great. I do want to mention this XA equals nan in case you don't know. Nan represents not a number. It's a specific bit pattern that says this is basically like a null or unknown in here. And we're going to reference this a few times. So that was one nice little change in the optimization. Unfortunately, if we look carefully, the condition 1 and condition 2 it came up with do match correctly these else and else if statements on the left, but the last condition isn't quite right. Anybody want to take a stab at what's not quite right there? All right. This block on the lower left only happens if total read is greater than or equal to 5. Right? We have if case, we have else, and the final else here. So if the total read's under 5, we're not going to get to this last case. However, what ChatGPT created for us doesn't include that. By just and being not the other 2 conditions, it skipped over that. And so when we get down to the bottom and it uses condition 3, it's overwriting some of the things that were initialized to 4 and NaN. So depending on your level of coding knowledge, it might take a little while to figure out why doesn't this quite work? What did it do that was different? And so, as I mentioned at the very start, if you're coming in and expecting it to just magically write perfect code for you, you're going to be sorely disappointed. So in any case, thought, well, ChatGPT will write code for me, so write the test function. I did change the name slightly, normalize A and normalize B, but said, hey, write this. I want to call both these functions and compare the 2, and then have it do the work for me. ChatGPT, did you write the correct code? Write a test function, and if it passes, I'll feel good about it, and if it doesn't, then I'll have to figure out what's wrong. Well, it doesn't pass, and even worse, it doesn't pass because the test isn't right. So here's one thing. We know that there are 2 variables or values that come out of each call, and ChatGPT figured, okay, I need to compare the first return from normalize A with the first return from normalize B, and the second with the second, only it overwrote R equal with the second comparison. So it lost whether or not the first 2 values were the same. And then it's maybe not completely wrong, but then the if statement tests if R equal XA and R equal XA. It's either definitely true or definitely false. That's not quite right. There's another problem here. Do we have anybody with enough MATLAB experience to guess why that function isn't the right one? Cliff, can I put you on the spot? You got me guess.
No guess here.
All right. Well, not a number is not a number. Are 2 not a numbers the same? I don't know. Is not one the same as not one or not two? Not necessarily. So in a lot of languages, or a lot of times, you have to tell explicitly that not a number is the same as another not a number or not. So they may or may not be comparable. In this case, is equal is the wrong function. Is equal, if the two matrices have not a number in the same place, still returns not equal, because it says you can't compare them. Let's push that on the stack for a moment. And then I would claim just that this little bit of code was not very good. You might recall that these functions return an X and an XA matrix, and the names it's come up with are a little confusing with XA_A, but the first return is actually an X matrix. So not great code from there. All right. So I figured out that part of the problem with this test was that it wasn't using the right equality function. Unfortunately, ChatGPT helped me out. Rather than doing a Stack Overflow look or something, I just asked it, hey, can you tell me how I compare two matrices that have NaN values? And it immediately hooked me up with is equal N, which was the right thing. So that was a win. All right. So I apologize. There are a few intermediate steps along the way here, but we won't worry too much. Then I asked it to convert the MATLAB code to Python. If you have a chance to look in the repository that's linked there, you'll find my actual prompt. I guess autocomplete in my browser changed my prompt. Please convert this from MATLAB to Python with the NumPy package. And instead, my prompt to ChatGPT was, please convert this from MATLAB to Python with the dumpy package. But ChatGPT knew what I wanted, and it gave me the right thing, mostly. This is the original version on the left that still has the condition problem, so it correctly pulled that across. But it did a couple of funny things. One, it gave the analogous load for data, but it assumed that I had it in NumPy format. Way back in the earliest code, we actually have this data coming in with the matlab.mat file. So this assumes that I have some other tool for converting my data over, which is not necessarily true or helpful. And then it just has this funny extra little bit of code here that it decided that it needed to create a copy of xref and xnref and then spew that through the code. So it's a little bit messy from that. Then we have one more, and this is also a subtlety. Again, you got to bring your coding knowledge here. Xref copy is an integer array. It has only integer values in it. So when it gets loaded, NumPy creates an array that only holds integers. So the very next line below these two, setting them to NaN, doesn't work. NaN is a floating point value, and integer arrays can't handle it. So this code, when you run it through Python, immediately barfs and says, can't do that. So there's a fix to tell it, yes, I want an MDU array like this one, but I want it to be able to hold floating point values. Again, you're going to have to bring some of your own knowledge to the party here. But it was nice to have it move all this code over for me. It's a question. It's sort of a toss-up of whether me writing it myself and investigating exactly what the details of the MATLAB code were outweighed asking ChatGPT to write it and then testing after the fact. So again, sort of like with the is equals function, I was able to ask MATLAB or ChatGPT to help me load my data from the .mat file, and it did find me SciPy.io, which was helpful. And then I was able to put some of those together with Octave instead of MATLAB. I wasn't ready to buy a license for that, just for one demo, and create some reference data from the function I had extracted out of the MATLAB code, capturing its inputs and outputs, and then could save that and bring it over to the Python code, where I then called the same function and compared it against the outputs to the other one. So I think there's a useful loop here of asking AI to help you write some code and also asking it to write the test functions for your code, and then getting to a place where you feel comfortable because you have both of those. In fact, we'll try working on that with loading some data out of a CSV. And what I've also written is just I think have 6 values in a test CSV file where I know what the mean and variance are. So my test function first, my test function runs against my own data for which I know the answer. So I know that the test function is good, and then I can feel that the test function is telling me the right thing about the extraction code. Fix the conditional bug, making sure that we got the total read in there. And then as we started, the code is over there in at that link. So let's take our chances and try to do some live work here. So even if you have just a free account with GitHub, I think you get 120 hours of code spaces, which is time on VMs hosted by GitHub. Just for those of you who haven't tried it, the way this works, from the code spaces link, you select which repository you want. In this case, I'm going to create my own repository. Just in case I need a little bit more memory, I'm going to bump up 4 cores. And then this should take 15 to 20 seconds to get us running. So now, how many of you have used VS Code? A few of you, okay. I recommend it, although if you're in the Python world, I guess, well, if you're in the R world, you're clearly in RStudio. If you're in the Python world, there's a good chance you're in JetBrains or Spider and some others, but VS Code is pretty good. And one of the advantages of using the code space is that it runs directly in your browser. You don't have to install anything in your own machine. So let's see. Let's go to our Copilot example. And I have a series of prompts here. What I have is some data that came from US CDC on influenza cases 2015 through 2019 by week, explicitly chosen to avoid any unusual events in the past few years. So I would like to just from the start figure out what are the means for number of cases each week. So let's give this a shot with a new file. All right, you go. Will you all hear me if I put the microphone down and I project?
Yeah.
They may not hear me there. All right, well, I need 2 hands. So we'll try that. All right, so Copilot, I don't think I have it. Yes, install that. And then also a small thing, if you try this out and it suggests to you to install the Python extension or any of these other extensions, you're working in a GitHub code space. So you're not installing anything to your own machine, so you can feel free to experiment until you start typing your credit card number and other things in, and you might want to care about where your extension is coming from. And well, I don't know why I'm apologizing. I was sad to find out that while Copilot will give you 1 month of free time, which I thought was great for this demo, it'll only give you a month of free time after you put your credit card in and decide that you will explicitly opt out a month later if you don't want it, which I didn't figure you all would be ready to do. However, I have it, so let's give it a shot. And I can barely see. So let's close that up. Let's close that up. So here I have a new file. I start by letting the system know if I wanted to run this directly that I would use Python, which will give Copilot a little bit of a clue. And it turns out the one other, well, let's, well, here. Copilot has already looked through my local files, has looked into the prompts that I have, which include, oh, create a script here with a script for this package.
It's possible to increase the font size.
Yeah.
It is, and I will be happy to do that. Let's ditch this so we have a little bit more space. How's that?
Better.
Better or Good.
Much better. Good enough.
Good enough. Okay. Let's see if we can get it to suggest that again. All right. And let's also turn on word wrap so we can see the full suggestion. All right. So it turns out that in this environment, if I run the debugger, it runs this from the root of my environment as opposed to running it in the same directory as the script. So I just want to know where the script is so I can use that. And I say, sure, let's do that. So yep, give me a path from pathlib and take this current file so it knows about the file being the path of the script and what to do there. Let's see if it suggests some other things. So as you can see, it's running through my other files. So this is exactly what I want to do. But let's just take a quick look at the data. So we note there's a comment in the first line and then the column names are below that. So the prompt it's come up with is exactly right. I would like to do this in pandas. I would like to skip the first line, and that is the file I want. Although in this case, maybe we would want the function. Well, in this case, it's doing it directly in our script instead of creating a function for me, but I guess that's all right. All right, let's see if it also grabs. That is exactly what I want. Turns out the influenza data has A type and B type, and I would like to look at the two of them together. And calculate mean variance is what I want. So it does that. However, this is where it pushes my own knowledge of pandas. I don't know exactly where it stuck that information. So I want so it starts doing that. The data frame calculates the mean, calculates the variance, returns those two, and even knows that. Have to remember to actually accept things before looking at them. Even knows that the variance function can do population or sample variance for me. All right, so now I don't need this. I would like to do that. So use the data frame that I've already created, and then I would like to print it. All right. Well, as mentioned, it has read ahead. I would like to make sure that it's doing the right thing. So please write me a function that will read in my reference values. Here. Yep, from the scripter, we need one. Actually, it figured out that there was test case. I think they've changed the name of that, though. Reference actually is the correct name.
Hey, Chris,
Yes, sir.
how is it coming up with like the next line? Is it like you're hitting tab, you're hitting this?
Once it puts in the gray text, then I can hit tab to accept it. Every once in a while, it will know that it's got a couple of options, and I can use the arrow keys to choose one or the other. But generally, it just gives me one.
Just trying to understand how you get to like how the lines suddenly appearing.
Well, that's where, as I mentioned, I commented early on about the context sizes for these different things, and I believe that Copilot is looking also either at my prompts that I saved over here that I was intending to actually copy in and use to drive this, or it's looking at the previous version of this that I already created to test the thing and realizing he probably wants to do something similar to what he did before. But either way, all right. Either way, it's using other code in my own repository for its context to suggest things.
Now, is it learning, is it saving this anywhere on its own so that it knows better what people want from it?
I do not know the answer to that.
Yeah. I imagine there might be some interesting legal challenges about putting what kind of code can you show it.
I think our panel folks alluded to that just
Yeah.
briefly, that there's a question, when you use, I know that Microsoft has exposed some of their LLMs through an API that you can put your own context in and your own prompt and then get the data back. And if I recall correctly, in the terms of usage is that this is still under development, and that particularly if they find that some answer has something offensive or otherwise that they wouldn't want the system to output, that then they reserve the right to look at what your inputs are in order to figure out how to train it to avoid that. So they have sort of a limited view into the material there. I don't think they use any of the things that you submit for their training, but you'd have to look at the licensing and the user.
This, you said it's looking at other files and kind of preemptively generated prompts. I mean, it's looking at, in addition to this repository, you also have data in this repository, right?
I do.
So it could potentially be looking in that file as well.
Yes, I don't know to what extent it can figure out the schema of that. So for a CSV, I would suspect it probably can.
Because you just skip the first line. And,
Well, that I'm sure came from one of my other prompts, either from the text file or something else.
I'm just thinking of related to that question in terms of if that's then going back into training data on Copilot side, what should we be thinking about from a data privacy perspective using a tool like this?
Yes. I would have to look more closely at the terms of use. And just for my own sake, I would probably not I would not put any PII or sensitive data into GitHub repository.
Hey, Chris, quick question.
Yes, sir.
So if you had like an empty repo,
Yep.
It's just basing it off of its like knowledge based on previous repos and like writing code, right? So like if you had like an empty repo, you would have a different experience in this demo.
You would. And so I apologize that it has stolen my thunder. All of the things that it suggested to me in this case are the prompts that I initially came up with and then in order to try to run this demo. So I actually...
So just to be clear, like you're writing human readable sentences.
Yep.
And this Copilot is giving you code to do that.
Yep. And
so you're like, you just saved like an hour of writing code by writing a couple sentences. Okay.
Yes. So I think we basically, other than it got the old name of our test data. And then I think it will probably suggest that we actually call the test function. Oh, it did. There we go. And all right, live demo. I think we need had a problem with the tool. All right. Well.
So the message is definitely have it right test code.
Definitely have it right test code. We are going to reconvene in the big room in about 8 minutes. So I would just like to skip over, actually, Steve, would you like to suggest one more thing you would like it to do? Something that I hadn't previously thought about?
Oh,
Find the peaks.
Find the peaks.
Incidents. We need the times, the dates, right? When it occurred, and pull the histogram.
And the corresponding weeks. So you want within a window though, right? You sort of want the peak with, this is 4 years worth of data. So do you want just the maximum?
Well, I guess the months of the peaks or something.
So the data we have is cases per week.
Yeah.
For 4 years.
Yeah, but it's a person for your time period. So I'm curious when the peaks are most often, December, January.
Be looking for
So
local
for
maxima.
each year, when's the
Right,
peak?
okay.
That's tricky though, because you don't know if that
No,
that
we won't
could be a
have tricky
like a
questions.
sliding window.
We want simple things. We want it to break.
Let's see if it will suggest anything else here.
You haven't accepted the NP bid, I think.
Well, for some reason, I put it in a comment.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
So you're actually beyond my knowledge of sci-fi signal, so I have no idea. Is Fine Peaks an actual function out of sci-fi signal? Anybody
We're gonna
know?
Find out.
At this point, I would probably do.
Search for that, right?
a quick
And
search.
with this,
2 hours of typing.
yeah, have you tried plotting with this? Because like plotting, I
have.
feel like takes so
Yeah.
much time.
I had mixed results with that, so let's just briefly, in my Python code. Oh, actually, I asked it, so we're running low on time, but you all might find this interesting. I asked it to write, here, this is my prompt. Simulate SEIR model, given the following things, number of days simulate, return SEIR for each day using NumPy. It didn't quite write this code. It actually missed the exposure or incubation rate that it needed, and I had to add that back in so I could fix it. But it wrote basically all of this code for me for the SEIR model, and then I asked it to run the model and plot the results with MATLAB, and I should be able to run this. And sure enough, it dumps out that for me there.
And how long did that take for you to do that?
Less than 5 minutes. I had pretty good success as well, asking it to do SIR models in R. And I don't know if anybody else will find this amusing, but it had much more trouble trying to plot through R. So its first try here was not successful. I had to do a bit of looking myself to figure out what else it needed in order to get it. And I don't have R installed in this code space, which by the way, you can do. You can install R, you can install Octave. Takes about 5 minutes for each of those. And I don't have an example, but I did manage to get it to do the ping output of this SIR model from R.
Could you show us the plotting command for SEIR in the Python one?
So it was
How do you code it? What did you use?
Here we go.
Equation.
import matplotlib, run the model, create a figure.
Yep.
Plot before.
Yeah.
Which method did it use for solving? the
Yeah, how
differential
did it do
equation? Which method did it use?
Oh, it just ran right here in.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's terrible.
Yes, it's terrible, and yet
That's,
write me an SIR model. You know,
It's not efficient at all.
Well,
agreed.
and it works only in very,
So Euler scheme, I guess,
if
right?
numbers get too big,
yeah, it will explode.
but this is probably what you would teach.
Couldn't you prompt it to ask specific, like for a specific method?
Probably, yeah.
Then if you're not happy
Yeah.
I'm going to escape here on time. And say, you have, if you take this URL with you, there's the instructions there to import this repository, to create a code space, it gives you you get 124 hours. So you actually get like, you get 2, but you can install R, you can install Octave, you can sign up for yourself with Copilot. You can do that right there. The other thing I didn't demo for you is that it's a little bit of a hassle, but you can ask ChatGPT any of these questions. You can even ask it to modify the code And it will give you a prompt with a copy, all of this stuff that you just copy paste into your runtime environment and try it.
Remember, you're flushing the water every time. You're flushing the bottle of water every time you do.
Not necessarily. You can continue the chat with chat.
So that he's referring to
Every
that.
time you submit the query, it's a bottle of water, right? The presentation was.
The one in the earlier talk, they discussed the energy and such resources that go into this, and like pouring out a bottle of
Yeah,
water.
I think about that. Okay.
I was wondering, yeah, what if you found Copilot?
Oh, I find Copilot great. I mean, one of the things is just to come in here, I think I mentioned this before, I would like. So it basically just copied my prompt. But it goes through so much doc string, and actually I
Boilerplate?
I have to write Google formatting for the doc string, so what it is. And so it looks and realizes that I can. So when it writes the doc string, it actually.
And this
saves
is
all of the
much more
results,
sensible
looks
than
at all
my exploration.
So I was able to see like for 2030.
You should write up like 30 minutes a day. In code writing, you like write some boilerplate, like I'll go to these
No. We're not doing the hardware anymore. So did you actually sign up for the more efficient? Okay, so you actually.
Efficient by this year.
So you, I don't.
I've got another thing what this is doing.
But I guess it's basically talking to ChatGPT.
It's a specialized version. It's based off of ChatGPT, then with extra training on. I think it's public repository.
I wonder about the argument, like, yeah, my GitHub repository has a certain license, and if you use it, then you have to use a certain license. And are they using?
That was also something that I avoided talking about, which is there are a lot of questions there of, okay, public is not the same as unlicensed. Right? So it's learned all of these.
Yeah. So,
But-
you know, do I have a legal case to say, okay, it was trained off my data, or my method that had this